Good evening, everybody. So tonight's presentation is going to be a little bit of a question and answer session. So over the last week, I had a friend write to me and ask, what's the deal with fat? Why is it that instead of promoting things like olive oil and coconut, you're mentioning reducing or eliminating some of these things, but those are plants, right? So what's the big deal? Well, it has to do a lot with kind of two things. One is the basic premise of the whole food plant-based diet is not really just about maximizing or minimizing any particular nutrient. See, Americans have gotten really, really used to and comfortable with the idea of not just eating a food, but looking at that food and saying, okay, we've got our dairy, we've got our meat, we've got our vegetable, that you kind of feel like you got to put something in there, like begrudgingly, a little vegetable just to sneak it in because it's supposed to be good for you, right? And we've really gotten to this temperament of tearing apart our food and saying, well, here's the fat, we don't call it meat, we call it protein. You see that on the advertisements, 30 grams of protein, and so it's going to be, hugely healthy for you if you got all that extra protein in there. As though our lives are built around getting one particular hyped up nutrient, for example. And in the process of splitting things apart and oversimplifying in that sense, you lose a lot of the details. So, for example, someone might look at a bowl of oatmeal and think, oh my gosh, and then compartmentalize that and call it a bowl of carbs. Did you eat your carbs, today? Or they might go on an Atkins diet and say, oh no, I can't have carbs, that's terrible. And similarly, people do similar things with gluten, for example. They might look at some whole wheat and say, oh wow, look at all that gluten in there. And the body doesn't necessarily see things as a carb or a saturated fat or something. That's the language of our food industry. They love to be able to basically create a something or other that sort of vaguely resembles food, and they can dial up or dial down any of these ingredients. So they can dial down the saturated fat because people know that saturated fat's not good for them, so they dial down the saturated fat and they put a ton of sugar and salt in there to compensate for it. So when you've got these little dials, well, you can advertise to people, look, my product is 0 grams of fat, my product is 0 grams of sugar, and when you've got these little components that you can dial up and dial down, well, people are a little bit more easy to confuse, and the next thing you know, people are saying, well, I don't know what the heck to believe. These people are, like my question that came up tonight was saying, well, you're talking about eating plants, but not this particular plant, what gives? So that's the kind of the basic premise, is trying to, instead of looking at the components, look at the whole food and what impact does that have on your health. So one of the downsides to, let's use olive oil as an example, is that it's a very, very, very highly refined food. If you're wandering around the plains of, pick a continent, about 5,000, 10,000 years ago, you would not run into a bottle of olive oil. You might run into an olive tree, depending on what part of the world you lived in, of course. Let's say you're roaming around the Mediterranean, 5,000 years ago. Maybe before they figured out how to squish those things into olive oil. So our current state of the olive oil is it's a very, very highly refined, very, very concentrated food. And when it gets into the system, it actually has an impact that's different, very different than just plain old eating an olive. So when you eat an olive, yes, you get a little bit of the fat, but you also get the fiber and you get the unprocessed micronutrients, all the stuff that goes from a regular olive. And it's one of those little things in life that sometimes you can learn some information, but not necessarily act on it until a while later. So when I first met Dr. Esselstyn and heard about this low-fat, whole food, plant-based diet pattern thing that I've been talking a lot about over the last few years to those that have seen me in clinic or know my story. And so I'd gotten to where I'd kind of gotten rid of most of the olive oil in my own personal cooking. And so I kind of half believed what Dr. Esselstyn was saying. I kind of knew it, but I didn't fully act on what I knew. And I was like, do I really trust this guy? This sounds a little extreme, what's that sort of thing going on? And basically, after a little while, I moved back home here to Florida and started to have food that had a fair amount of olive oil in it. And I gained somewhere around 25, 30 pounds, something like that. Which, by the way, once we eliminated the oil, came away too, thank God. So, little personal story there for you guys. But basically, it wasn't until my very close friend was in the hospital having a heart attack, or had just had a heart attack, that I went to my favorite website in the world, nutritionfacts.org, the brainchild of Dr. Greger, and I looked up heart disease. And that day, literally the day that my friend went into the hospital for a heart attack, there was this big presentation on olive oil. Shocker of shockers. And what it was pointing out is the thought that this is healthy has motivated an entire industry to go out and really plug olive oil as healthy. It's part of the Mediterranean diet, and Mediterranean diet's got to be good for you, so therefore the olive oil is too. The trouble is, Mediterranean diet is really not terribly far off from the whole food plant-based. Yeah, it's got a little chicken and fish, which we can get into a debate about another time. I don't think those are really healthy either. And if you check out some other videos, you'll find out a little bit more about some of the reasons I talk about it in that way. But basically, it's not because of the olive oil that the Mediterranean diet has an impact, but it is despite the olive oil. So they did some studies looking at how good is the function of the inside of the heart blood vessels. So the endothelial lining, so if this is a blood vessel and the inner lining of that blood vessel it's kind of like a thin layer of cells. It's kind of reminiscent of an onion, those little tiny thin layers of an onion, if you really get scientific and try to peel that thing apart. And that little tiny layer of cells, we used to basically think it was just an inert lining. It was just kind of sitting there because it had to be there, because something had to line those cells, right? And so that endothelial function turns out to be critically important in how your blood vessels to your heart are performing, how the blood vessels to the brain are performing, to the penis of the guys with erectile dysfunction, all that kind of stuff. If that inner lining is damaged, well, guess what? Things down there don't work so good, things to the heart don't work so good, and the blood vessels to the brain don't work so good. And so basically that damage sets the stage for the inflammation in the inner lining of the heart that sets the stage for the for later buildup of plaques and all sorts of things going on. So when we were looking at this and having this revelation about, oh shoot, those guys were telling the truth, there seems to be some link between the amount of oils and such consumed and the risk over not just days, but kind of over decades of the impact of what it is that we're taking in on the impact of our blood vessels, our heart, other body organs and things as well. So the link I'll put down in the comment section for the Facebook video for those who are looking to that olive oil study. But basically, shortly after taking in some olive oil, the arteries are essentially paralyzed for a little while, and that peaks a few hours after that oil is consumed, and then gets better afterwards. And in the study, if I remember right, they compared things like the olive oil to, I think it was some fast food, I think from McDonald's, essentially, one of those fast food sausage and McMuffin breakfast or something like that. So details are all going to be in the link to the presentation for those who are interested. And it's a brief video. It's only about 3 minutes long. Highly suggest watching it more than once to kind of allow the information to sink in, because it can definitely be life-changing. Also, when people are looking to reverse chronic diseases, so like reversing diabetes, reversing heart disease, the study that was done, that Dr. Esselson and further studies by Dr. Ornish basically show that a very strict low-fat, whole food, plant-based diet is what's required to actually open those vessels up and reverse the disease. So the work by Dr. Ornish, he found that some of the study participants didn't really stick strictly to the diet pattern. Some of them drifted off a little bit, and others really drifted off a lot. And as a result of that natural human tendency to be somewhere in between, he was able to really map out, okay, well, what happened to the people that were on the whole food, plant-based, no added oil diet? What happened to the people that were not? And was able to show that the closer people got to that whole food, plant-based, strict version of the diet, the better their outcomes were, the less heart attacks, strokes, and even prostate cancer reversal, which is pretty darn amazing if you ask me. So it is a really beautiful work. If you want to check out Dr. Ornish's book, The Spectrum, and some of his other resources, please check out my heart disease video. I listed Dr. Esselson's or Ornish's and everybody's references. I think I got like 20 references underneath those two presentations. So please check out that as well. So yes, Dylan is asking, so no olive oil, it's not as healthy as you think it is. Yes, that is exactly what I'm saying. Now, given that I almost lost my best friend to a heart attack about, a year ago or so, 2 years ago now, thank you. It is one of those things that we have adapted to, basically learning how to cook without the stuff. And once you get some of the basics down, it's easy. And if you really want a quick pick way to do it, my favorite doctor in the world has got I apologize, this will be backwards, a How Not to Die cookbook with a whole bunch of whole food, plant-based, no added oil recipes. And there's a couple other ones I just happen to have handy. This one is vegan kitchen kind of recipes. I'll hold up for a few seconds so you can read it backwards. Vegan Reaches Indian Kitchen and Everyday Kitchen. I mean, there's a lot of recipes in these books as well. We've got more on the shelf over there. I've got a whole slew of these that, in fact, you can check out the video. One of the first ones I did, which is about all the resources that we have available. But the thing that I liked about these other books is, yes, they include the original oil that people think that they have to use, but she's got modifications already built into the recipes, so this is how you do it without the oil, for example. And Nancy's saying, what can we use instead? Because again, so many of us are pre-programmed that that's what you do in the kitchen. You have your pan, you put your olive oil in, and then you add the onions or spices or whatever else you do. So what you use instead depends on what you're doing. So, for example, I tend to be a little bit simple with the style of cooking for everyday stuff, and instead of using oil, you can use a non-stick pan. You can use a little bit of water or a little bit of broth. We often use the generic broth that you get at the grocery store down the street. So the key with that is experimenting, play around with it. I mean, there are recipes galore out there. I mean, the fact is that this information has been out since the 1970s. Dr. Pritikin back in the day, and then Dr. Ornish and Esselson, and several more have created documentaries and entire support systems. Thank you. I'll show off a couple more cookbooks here. And in these types of cookbooks, they actually often will go over some tips and things for so how you can make these different kinds of things completely without any oils and whatnot. So it actually is very easy once you kind of get the first mindset of, wait, what do you mean I don't need to use this stuff for my everyday cooking? I even had some people suggest, well, what if I just spritz it in the can a little bit? Well, as Dr. Esselson would say very loudly, not one drop of oil. And Ornish, I think, would be a little softer because, that spectrum kind of thing. But spectrum, see, there we go. I already got the props in my hands. But basically, sometimes when people talk about these things, yes, the question is also, is avocado oil okay? What about avocado? What about coconut? No. The impact of what does it do to the body is really the point. I was picking on olive oil because it's such a thing that people talk about the most, I guess, as far as being like a healthy thing to do, a healthy fat. So the whole food plant-based diet approach is not a approach where, in general, you squeeze the avocado, you squeeze the olive. It's kind of like trying to say drink orange juice instead of eating an orange. There's a big difference on how orange juice and an actual orange impacts basic body physiology and chemistry. So when you down some orange juice, as some of my diabetics know, that is one of the fastest ways to spike your blood sugar that there is. Whereas if you eat an orange, you're getting all sorts of other stuff along with it. You're getting the fiber and other kinds of things that slow down that absorption of it as well. And so, yes, I'm making the point really of avoiding oil, no oil. And even, as I was saying, even the folks that are saying, well, I use that little Pam spray stuff and it sprays a little bit on the bottom. Well, again, it depends on what you're doing. The research shows that if you want to open up the arteries to the heart, if you've got a big disease to prevent or reverse, then the highly processed, highly refined oils, which is essentially like squeezing the juice out of the oranges, you're squeezing the juice out of the olives and getting this really high concentrated, not found in nature kind of product, and then who knows, it sits on the shelf, it gets adulterated. That's a whole nother topic too, is you think you're getting extra virgin olive oil, but many times, if they actually do the studies, it might be 30% canola oil with enough olive oil to make us think that it's actually that sort of thing. So some of the labeling they've been finding is not as accurate as people might think. So, and then breaking out the unsaturated versus the saturated fats. So there's a kind of a difference between the saturated fat that you get from two sources. The plant version of that is coconut, and the animal version of that is pretty much everything. So saturated fat is found in dairy, it's found in meats of all sorts, it's found in, yes, even fish has saturated fat. People think fish is really healthy because it's got those omega-3s and a few unsaturated fats in there, but it also is really, really loaded with saturated fat. Even the boneless, skinless chicken breasts that people are eating these days, thinking that they're crazy healthy for them because our culture and marketing, they've got a really, really good marketing impact for this industry, is telling them that it's the healthy way to be. Well, guess what? Those chickens are fed Prozac, they're fed Benadryl, they're fed all sorts of antibiotics and all sorts of other things that cause them to be kind of a little bit diabetic, because basically they have to put on that weight in a very short amount of time. And then when people consume that stuff, the saturated fat is already embedded in the muscle in the wrong place. So they're basically getting more unsaturated fat in their system that then goes and clogs up the insulin receptors that are in your muscles, and that causes the diabetes and basically all the other things. So I'm going to just run off a little list of things that are linked with saturated fat. So aneurysms, Alzheimer's, bacterial vaginosis, colon cancer, coronary artery disease, decreased male fertility, not just in the erectile dysfunction department because that depends on the blood vessels, but also the amount of testosterone that the guys are making is also lower with that saturated fat. Dementia, a lot of research between Alzheimer's and the intake of saturated fat. Diabetes, the hardening of the arteries, the heart attacks, the heart disease, high cholesterol, breakdown of the lining of the intestines, which then leads to leaky gut, which then contributes to our influx of autoimmune diseases like asthma and so forth. Again, I'll make a video on that one of these days. Kidney problems, non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, gum disease, periodontal disease, skin aging and wrinkling, and strokes. So that is a short list of some of the things as well. Dylan asks if you're vegan and don't plants contain saturated fats? The main plant that contains saturated fats and which Dr. Esselstyn recommends to avoid is coconut. So coconut oil and coconut are loaded with saturated fats. In Dr. Esselstyn's work, they recommend defatted coconut flakes, which are a thing out there. And then, again, it depends a little bit on which flavor of these folks are you listening to, and also what is your purpose in adopting a whole food plant-based diet pattern and stuff like that. So it all depends on what you want in life. That's one of the reasons why I did a whole video on just kind of figuring out what's your goal. What do you want? If your goal is to muddle through life and I don't know, just do whatever the heck you want, you're probably going to do that anyway. If part of your goal in life is to live a long, healthy life and follow the tips and advice of some of the people that have lived to, the hundreds, then check out things like the Blue Zones book by Dan Buettner. I think that's his name. I'm saying it right there. And there's one common thing that I've read when I was noticing that book is that the folks that are following that pattern, they're literally like 98, 99% plant-based most of the time, and then for somebody's birthday they might have, I don't know, kill a pig or something like that and have some broth from that mixed in with all their veggies and other whole grains that they're having and so forth. So it is kind of a very personal thing that everybody does. The one word that I'll just respond to you, Dylan, one more time on that is the V word, and so the vegan word. So that's one of the few words that at these conferences you'll very rarely hear spoken, because when people talk about vegan, they're really talking about I don't do that, I don't do that, I don't do that, I don't do that, I don't do that kind of stuff. They're focusing on all the stuff that you don't eat. And whole food plant-based is more descriptive of what you do eat. You eat plants. What kind of plants? Whole plants, as much as you can or as close as you can. So, for example, there's a very big difference in the way that the body processes refined rice, such as white rice, and the way that it processes like whole grain rice, for example, brown rice. And there's a whole thing about arsenic in rice, which I encourage you to check out so you know some tips on how to avoid that, because that's been a thing for a few years, but without going to the weeds on that. So if you're eating a pile of white rice, it raises your risk of diabetes and blood pressure and insulin resistance, all sorts of things. Whereas when you eat the whole grain version of it, it actually lowers your blood pressure and lowers the risk for these things. Take bread, for example. So you go to the store, you get you some nice refined grain white bread. What's that going to do to the body? It's going to increase your abdominal circumference. It's going to raise your insulin. It's going to cause diabetes, down the line effects, and it's associated with all those heart attacks and other kinds of things. But if you get the whole grain bread, one of my favorites for that is, I think that's the Ezekiel kind. There's other ones that are out there, I'm sure, but this is just something we happen to have in the local grocery stores around here in the freezer section. That's sprouted, whole grain, no oil bread that fits with this whole food, plant-based diet pattern. So it's something very easy. So when people have 3 servings of whole grains per day, can be quinoa, can be whole wheat, can be whole grain bread, can be brown rice, or that sort of thing. Well, guess what? That's as effective as taking a blood pressure medication, and combining these kinds of things with some exercise. Marcus is asking, what's better, blending or juicing? Because he's doing a fast. So similarly to what I was talking about before with the difference between orange juice and an orange is that fiber. So generally speaking, if you're going to be doing some of those things, blending, you're going to get everything in there. All that fiber is like gold to your gut bacteria. Your colon will thank you. In fact, there's a lot of studies that show that the higher the amount of fiber you eat, the lower almost all of these chronic diseases. It's kind of like our body was, came from a long line of critters that ate plants for a long time, then somewhere along the way decided that, I don't know, mastodon was tasty or something, and then kind of switched things up a little bit, and it's been downhill ever since. Sorry, a little tongue-in-cheek humor for you. But our guts are essentially optimized with just lots and lots and lots of fiber. If you look at what the poop was of a caveman, they actually, believe it or not, there are people who specialize in looking at fossilized poop, and they have fossilized human poop from like 10,000 years ago. Well, that poop is very much like monkey poop because it's like 98% fiber. I don't know, there might have been some termites or something in there. And basically, the fibers, the fruits and vegetables, the things that they had to chew on in those days were very, very, very different than the modern day things. For example, if you ever get a chance to look up what did old watermelons look like, literally the watermelon part is like this little itty bitty pink rind, and then this giant, white seeds and things like that. And then over time, we grew it out so that we had like all this nice pink stuff, and the seeds were like almost nothing. You just spit them out or something like that. And so cherries are another example. So if you've ever eaten a original cherry, we used to have one of those, couple of those basic little wild cherry trees on my property growing up. Well, those things are bitter, and the seed is huge, and the amount of antioxidant-rich fruit is really, really tiny. So basically, those things that those people were munching on 10,000 years ago was very, very, very different than we're munching on today. And as I say, you don't ever see a monkey drive through a drive-through. You see them, chewing on various kinds of things in their environment. So very similarly, our gut really, really is designed to use the fiber as like part of the garbage chute. There's a whole bunch of stuff that binds to fiber and gets flushed out. Cholesterol, for example. So one of the best foods there is for binding cholesterol in the gut and flushing it out is collard greens in that example. And so what do which researchers do with that? Do they advise people to eat more collard greens? Well, they could, but they have a tendency to want to create one little pill out of the stuff so that they can sell it to you for a heck of a lot more money than they would make selling collard greens that you can't patent or anything. And so I think it's cholestyramine or well-called. Basically, they invented something that binds the cholesterol in the gut and flushes it down the toilet. And you could do the same thing by eating collards or other dark green leafies, but collards was one of the best in that category, according to one of the studies on that. Candace is asking now, what are good foods for migraines? Candace, I also invite you to check out my migraines video. I do have some foods on that specifically, but a quick tip is ginger is really good for migraines. There's a few others, lavender oil, the scent of it helped reduce migraines, and I think orange oil, and there was one other if I remember right, but no, maybe it was just orange, lavender oil, and the ginger. So for the migraines, the amount of ginger that was studied that was similar to the migraine medication is 1/8 of a teaspoon, and some people have heard my thing or seen my handouts and stuff like that, and they thought, oh, you're thinking about eating 1/8 of a teaspoon of ginger. No, it is not the ginger challenge, although I suppose you can do whatever you want if you want to try that. But basically, use 1/8 of a teaspoon of ginger in something. Maybe make a tea out of it. Maybe I use it with a soy milk chai, for example. That blends in very nicely with a little turmeric and stuff. So there's a couple of other things, so please check out my migraines video presentation. The links underneath it especially will be helpful. Marcus is asking now, what about nutrient loss due to air created from blending, and what green drinks do I recommend? Though I don't know anything about air causing problems with blending, but the one ingredient that I would recommend not using in a green drink is, believe it or not, apples. Because there is some studies that showed that when people blended up apples, the way the body processed it was different and actually caused insulin spike and a crash. So in other words, the insulin levels would go up and then suddenly crash, and people would feel a little bit more jittery and stuff thereafter, because the sugar might have fluctuated. And if you want all of the details of that, Dr. Greger on nutritionfacts.org has a wonderful video series about green drinks, and he's got a few recipes and such. For example, in his How Not to Die, if I can get it out, the How Not to Die cookbook. Actually, there's a lot of cool stuff in there. If I remember, I think he's got a whole chapter dedicated to smoothies. But pretty much, as far as it goes, there are a lot of references out there with different kinds of smoothie recipes. So if you take somebody who's not used to the bitterness of the greens, and you throw at them, like a kale lemonade smoothie or something, they might taste this fresh, very highly nutritious thing and then run away because they're not at all used to or adapted to the flavor of the fresh stuff. So this is the chapter 12 from this book called Sips. And in there, they're talking about a lemon ginger cooler, a golden chai, a banana chocolate smoothie, a pumpkin pie smoothie, a cherry berry, super green, and a V12 vegetable blast. And one of the fun things about subscribing to Dr. Greger's stuff is, and I'll just kind of show you some pictures from the book if you like to check out how some of these things look when they're plated and put out professionally, is the every now and then he actually puts out a thing where he's actually in the kitchen making these things. So on my whole food plant-based Facebook group, if you scroll down in there, you'll find some of Dr. Greger's videos where he's making, for example, his thing. But as you can see, just some beautiful recipes and ideas. Starting to get hungry, even though I just had dinner, So anyway, so these are pretty much anything that you like that's green can go into these smoothie kinds of things. And for some people, the benefit of having something in smoothie form is that a lot of people grew up hating things like spinach and kale and arugula and all those other incredibly healthy things. And if the only way you can get it into your body is through a smoothie, well, go for the smoothie. And again, the way that things are broken down, there's some really nice presentations about how some of when you break the cell walls of the plants, you really release all those micronutrients into a form that gets quickly absorbed by the body. So it's a quick way of replenishing magnesium and things. And if you have it in the form of where you get all the fiber from it, it's really good for nourishing the gut bacteria. And so different kinds of forms of things have, again, a different impact on the body. And so when you're looking at what to do for your entire life, what you do for your birthday probably doesn't have a heck of a lot of impact on you, 100 years later. But what you do almost every day for that 80, 90, 100 years, whatever your aspirations are, has a heck of a lot more to do with you being, stuck in a debilitated body versus having a vitality and a life and all of that kind of stuff. So that's pretty much it. The thing that is really, that I'd like to, emphasize on this is that these small choices, this information, first take it in and kind of mull over it, and please check out some of the resources that I have in the links for the references, so it's not just me doing a talking head kind of thing and babbling on about the virtues and awesomeness of plants, which are, by the way, the very first form of medicine that humans have used. But take it in, and if all you do is eat one extra piece of broccoli once in a while or an extra piece of fruit or something, that is moving in the right direction. Sometimes people see this information and think, oh my God, this is way too overwhelming. I'm never going to do any of that stuff. You're trying to sign me up for that vegan thing or something. Occasionally I get that. And it can be really overwhelming, and people are so identified with what's on the end of the fork, and families and all sorts of things. By the way, many things can be adapted into whole food, plant-based living. But yeah, so just kind of take it in and see where it leads you. The one thing I can say is that for my patients that have adopted this approach, whether it's moving 50%, 80%, or 100% of the way through it, the closer you get to that whole food, plant-based pattern in general, the better the health is universally. And doing it in a sustained, healthy way. In other words, don't just eat salads and think you're going to get some nutrient. Have some whole grains. Beans are amazing. Follow some of the guidelines, like Gregor's Daily Dozen app, for example. That's a free app, and it just has some of the highlights from his How Not to Die book and stuff in there. A lot of people have already kind of charted the way on how to do it. It's just, you gotta take a couple baby steps sometimes. And they say with behavior change, sometimes if you just do one little thing, like I saw an article recently about flossing one tooth. This person wanted to get in the habit of flossing all of her teeth every day and wasn't quite there. And so the idea was every day for, I think it was like 2 weeks, just floss one tooth. And everybody's like, man, I can floss one tooth, God, what are you talking about? And avoid the temptation to do the whole thing all at once and stuff. And so the idea there is just every day doing the same thing a little tiny bit builds up that pattern, that habit. And then after a while, your brain's like, come on, I got to do them all, And so using a little bit of that psychology of change stuff can be used proactively. So do I think everybody that watches this video is going to go whole food, plant-based, no added oil, that kind of thing overnight? No, probably not. I'm a little bit more realistic than that. Do I think a lot of people might get a few more fruits and vegetables and move a little bit more in the direction of that spectrum, a little more whole grains, a little more beans and all that kind of stuff? Yeah. A lot of people end up getting more of that stuff and getting some of the health benefits. Is it going to be powerful enough to reverse heart disease? Yeah, probably not. Is it going to be powerful enough to give you a little bit more resistance against things like the flu? And by the way, another thing I've been asked a lot is, do I still need to get the flu shot? Yes, please get the flu shot. We still have a few more months. According to the latest things on the CDC, we've not even reached the peak of this thing yet. It's very widespread. Go get it today, if you haven't yet, please. But back on topic, even if all people do is just get a couple more bites of fruit or vegetable or whole grain or something in life, then the purpose of this has been served. So let everybody do what they want, and hopefully you find, your jive, your health, your peace, your happiness, all that stuff can be benefited from the power of habits and the power of plants. So thank you for joining for this question and answer session. I hope I was able to answer your questions well enough regarding the difference between coconut oil and coconut and olive oil and olives and all of that. So this is not a no-fat diet. Some of those phytonutrients are absorbed better with seeds and things like that. But it is a whole food plant-based diet, so I hope you understand a little bit of the difference between eating some sunflower seeds and sunflower oil, highly processed, not good for the body the way it's handled. Anyway, have a wonderful night, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.